If I'm not centered, I cannot show up as a partner to a conversation.
One of my signals is if I'm hesitating sharing something with someone, I know something's off. And this is something I do know about you. Like if you sense something strange in a relationship, you'll bring it up.
Absolutely.
Like if you hang around with Yoav, you can count on that. So I'm joined today by Yoav Cohen, who is a good friend of mine and someone that I've worked with in several respects over the years. We worked together on a couple sort of small startup projects, and then we've done some coaching, and we work together now, at the time of this recording in a large consultancy, and Yoav is the president of that company. So welcome, Yoav. Thanks for joining me. Our jumping off point is going to be around the topic of feedback in the workplace, because working with Yoav, I noticed that he's able to give very honest and genuine feedback, and he does it in such a way that I think people don't feel threatened, or they don't tend to get too defensive. And it's an area that I've seen a lot of leaders struggle with. So I think there's a lot of richness there that hopefully we can learn from. So yeah, Yoav, thanks for joining me, and tell me about feedback.
It's funny you said that, because the first thought that I had when I was hearing you saying that is that recently I actually screwed up pretty badly with feedback that I gave someone.
Oh, really? And
yeah.
What do you mean by you screwed up, or how did you know you screwed up?
Well, it was very clear that I hurt that person.
Mm.
And I had a poor choice of words. I chose the wrong words. And then, afterwards, once I realized that, then I've been on a journey of cleaning that up ever since. But yeah, so you never get it right?
So you're still in the process of cleaning it up. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't. I don't fully believe her that she's
that
good.
It's okay.
And so, and so I make sure that I it's just like my side of the street is clear and clean as much as possible.
Got it. Yeah, and that's a tricky component of feedback, and maybe we'll use that as a point of entry, which is we never know how something that we share with someone is going to land. Like we can't know how somebody will respond to something. But instead,
it's sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
yeah, go ahead.
As a matter of fact, that instance is a really good example where I know what happened there. Like I can actually trace back to why did I hurt that person. And I heard that person because when I was giving the feedback, I actually had kind of like a jolt of fear inside of me. I think that when you give feedback to someone where you're not grounded, where you're not centered, then you are much more likely to cause harm versus, if you're actually, calm and collected and centered, and you give that feedback not from a place of wanting to change the other person, but from a place of curiosity, which in that moment, in that instance that I mentioned, I abandoned curiosity, right?
In that case, do you think you sort of slipped into a place of, I know what's right, or?
Oh, absolutely. But I also had like a very visceral experience of fear.
So were you anticipating a potential reaction? Is that where the fear was coming from?
I don't think that I went that far, even like in that moment. Okay. I was just almost like fight or flight kind of situation.
Got it. So I think in this conversation, hopefully we'll sort of surface some of the different variables that people can notice when they're giving feedback, and if it makes sense to give feedback. And I think the first one that comes to mind when, as we're getting started here, is what's the intention in giving the feedback? In other words, is the intention of the feedback in some way going to serve your needs, or is the intention genuinely there to serve the person that you're talking to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because, like, first of all, I have a little bit of an allergic reaction to this idea of feedback, right? Like giving feedback. That's not how I actually call it inside my head. I think that often when people say, Rob, I have some feedback for you, it's one is that they claim, like, how did that feel, right? Like when I said that, it's like, you needed to, like,
exactly.
what have I done wrong?
Yeah.
So there's a tightening that happens on the other side. And I think it's because people, I mean, all of us often when we think about feedback, we almost like have ownership of the truth, right? I see the truth, Rob. So I'm going to now tell you what is the truth, and you need to align to that truth of mine, right?
Right.
And over the years, what I learned is that, first of all, I'm wrong a lot of the times, and it's much more about sharing my experience, which is, it's a very different kind of dance when you share your experience, because first of all, I'm open to listen to your experience. And not only that, I'm open, I'm actually curious, right? And so from a place of me giving you feedback, it becomes a shared exploration, like something that we together on a journey explore. Well, what happened there? You know, like, what is your experience? What is my experience? And how can we find common ground there?
I mean, I think that's tremendously helpful if we can get there to that point of curiosity when we're sharing feedback. Because I think if you shared something with me and you said, hey, this is my experience, I'm not sure if it's right, I'm genuinely open to find out what was going on with you. I think that makes me much more willing to listen to that, and perhaps less concerned about potentially being embarrassed or feeling made wrong about what's coming next. I guess my question for you is, maybe you're not there, but a lot of times when I feel like I have some feedback to give, even though it's my experience, I'm usually pretty convinced I'm right. And so I'm wondering, how do you, like, do you just not go there, or like, how do you get yourself from like, hey, I'm going to give you off some feedback, I know I'm right about it because I can see it clear as day? Is that also your starting point, or are you genuinely more in a place like, oh, maybe I'm wrong?
Is it my starting point? I think that sometimes it is. And but there are some telltale signs where I know, oh, something's wrong, right? So I had a spiritual teacher that once told me that, for instance, thoughts about Rob are not important. Rob is important, but not thoughts about Rob. The reason I say that is because if I start noticing that I'm having a conversation with Rob in my head about the feedback I have for him, that's usually like a pretty strong signal for me that I am, again, like, I'm out of my center, I'm not grounded, and I'm not coming from a place of curiosity. And by the way, I think it's okay to, to use the old adage, like, to have strong opinions, but loosely held, right? So I might have a perspective that I'm convinced about, but also kind of like coming into a conversation and putting that aside and then tuning to what you have to say, right? And that requires listening. As a matter of fact, like, where it started, my starting point was pretty bad, actually. Like, so I used to be a very judgmental person. So you would talk to me, and then I'm like, Rob, I have some feedback for you. And then, like, da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And you would, most likely what would happen is that you would try to avoid me as much as possible, because it was such a unpleasant experience.
Wow, and you did that a lot. You did that for a period of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, a period of time, most of my life.
Wow.
And then we had a shared teacher, Mr. Steve Leeds, that he was such a clear symbol of curiosity. And when I saw that, and I saw the impact that he had on people and like how people responded to him, I saw that and I said, I want to be like that. Like, that is like, that's like a superpower.
Mm.
And so how can you engage in a very honest conversation with someone else and talking about whatever is happening in an authentic way? That is such such a skill that takes literally like years and decades to master and to do well, you know. And it's like one of the things that I, for a long time, it was like very much like a focal point for me. How can I engage in more authentic relationships with people? Now,
Mm.
this is an ideal, and yet Yoav is flawed. And so I do show up to relationships sometimes inauthentically. When I notice that, and usually I don't notice that in the moment, I notice that afterwards. I'm like, oh shit,
Mm.
like I didn't do it actually authentically. Then I need to go back and like clean that up. It's in some respect, it's a very unadvisable lifestyle, you know,
Right.
because you always need to
Well,
make sure that like, am I engaged? Go ahead.
but I guess I'm trying to understand what you mean by showing up authentically, because I might say like, Yoav, like your shirt sucks. And I'm just saying that because I'm being authentic. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a definition that's floating out there that being authentic means it's okay to say anything regardless of the impact, just because it's true for you, right? And I don't know that I don't think you'd have a lot of friends if you did that all the time. But what occurred to me when you started talking about Steve, and Steve is like, such a great role model of, I wouldn't even say giving feedback, I would just say communicating in an open, sort of non-judgmental way. What I suspect is Steve might be aware of his reaction to something. And I'm going to ask him this.
Absolutely.
He's aware of his reaction, but what he's curious about is the person's intention. The person's intention is something that we can be curious about. Like I don't know your intention in any given moment. I might know my
Mm.
reaction, like, wow, Yoav's being a jerk, blah, blah, blah. Clearly, I'm right. I can be curious about what's generating that behavior. And maybe that's the kind of point of entry to the curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, I would say that most of the time when I show up to conversations, I truly believe that I'm speaking to greatness on the other side, right? Like this is a choice that I'm making very consciously. I'm speaking
Hmm.
to greatness. And so that's how I show up to conversations, and I speak to people's greatness. And I think that to some extent, that's why people that end up working with me kind of like ascend or like grow or whatever you want to call that, because I am demanding, but I truly I'm here to support people on their journey, right?
Hmm.
I see people succeed. And in a way, like if I don't show up authentically, if I don't actually share my experience, then I'm not being in support of their journey.
I mean, when you're talking about that and this idea of speaking to greatness, one thing that occurs to me being around you in the workplace and in group meetings and things like that is, at least from the outside, I would say you bring a very high level of respect for anybody on the call, regardless of their position.
In some respects, like I think like all human beings, I care about status and I care about, well, I'm the president and blah, blah, blah. But most
Right.
of the time I would say that I think it's bullshit, right? And at the end of the day, what needs to win is really like the best idea. And if you're here to talk about and explore ideas, then hierarchy doesn't matter, right?
Mm.
What matters is like, where's the best idea? And often like people that are closer to a certain topic and the work have better ideas, right? I show up with curiosity, but also like I think that I show up with a desire to learn, right? If there's something that I can say that I do pretty well is actually I'm a curator, right? I might see Rob doing something, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting thing. I wanna curate just that thing to kind of
To
like my
learn from that.
toolbox, right?
Mm.
And I constantly have role models, and those role models can be anywhere in the organization. I don't care if like you're an engineer or a designer or you're Sir Martin Sorrell, right? Like if you have
Mm.
something that I view as compelling, then I will I will study that. I will learn from that. I will model that. Literally, sometimes it reaches levels of obsession, right? Like
Okay.
I have certain people that I've recorded, or like I listen to recordings of calls and so on, and I analyzed and deconstructed how they present a certain topic, how they go about certain issues. And I sometimes I even like not train, but practice by myself, and just almost like speak to myself, like how to go about explaining a certain thing or going about a certain topic. And it's because I'm thinking about, well, how would X do that, or how would Y do that?
All right, that's sort of irresistible to me as somebody who likes to model people. So and what you're talking about is modeling essentially. But so let's say you become interested in something that Stephen Leeds is doing. We'll use him as an example. So you're looking to see him in action, or to get recordings of him actually doing the behavior. Is that kind of your first step?
Absolutely. I went on YouTube. I remember back a while back, and I looked for videos of Steve Leeds, and I watched how he runs certain sessions, and I would watch them again and again and again. And every time, like, and sometimes, by the way, I would watch them for a period of time, forget about them, come back to them, I don't know, a year after, and all of a sudden you see them with completely new eyes, right? It's like you see different things that you didn't see a year ago. And yeah, it's a process that I really enjoy.
Let's say it's one interaction with Steve and somebody, like a demonstration. You're going to watch that multiple times?
Oh, absolutely. Not just watch. I will put it put it on my phone when I go on walks. I just listen to it. I don't watch it even. I just listen to it, and I start taking in the intonation, the breath. Of course, if I watch it, Steve talks a lot with his hands.
Right.
And there's a certain kind of like pace and cadence and tempo of, we talk about Steve, but other folks as well, that initially it's imitation, and usually I can think of many times where that imitation ends up being disastrous, because like I'm imitating someone rather than making it my own. And then after a while, I actually find my own voice. Like, who was it? Like Miles Davis that says it takes a long time to sound like yourself. So
yes,
after a while, like I learned how to use that tool, like Yoav, not like Rob, but like Yoav.
I think if you stop in the imitation phase, it can be problematic, because I think you imitate someone again and again and again, but at a certain point you have to, or you want to start to intuit what's generating these behaviors.
Absolutely.
Right? Like Steve's not just going, okay, I'm going to slow down now because I want to slow down. Like there's a reason that there's an impact that he's responding to in some way. So that's an interesting moment. Like, at what point does imitation become sort of an intuition about how you might respond? And then the other thing I sort of caught from your quick description is, then are you kind of imagining scenarios where you're testing out the same ability, or like, are you playing scenarios in your head, or are you just imagining that you're Steve? Like, what's the next step? Like, okay, I go to the park, I listen to this interaction a bunch of times.
I think mostly I will kind of like imagine certain scenarios and think of myself how I would interact in those scenarios.
Yeah, it's
usually these are like relevant scenarios, meaning like it's some meetings that are coming up in the coming week or a couple of weeks or whatever that is, but it's like very relevant to my life. I learned over the years that I try as much as possible. You mentioned like the shirt, right? So let's say that I think that your shirt might be, I don't know, ludicrous, right? And so I think it's much more powerful to you if you actually realize that, versus that I tell you, right? And so we might actually start exploring the notion of fashion and how does fashion affects Rob in his life, and And then we might explore that, and we might discover that you have some blockers around how you perceive yourself in terms of fashion, and in terms of like what you actually entitled to actually wear. And at some point you might actually point to like, oh, my shirt, that's actually a really good example for where I'm held back from wearing, I don't know, like Hawaiian shirts. I don't know whether, but it's much more about taking someone through their journey versus telling them, go and walk that path, because that's the right path.
So you're really taking a very tangential approach into that domain or that topic area. It's like, let's say you're feeling wow, Rob's wearing a shirt that's just obnoxious and horrible. So you might go like, hey, Rob, like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious about that
also,
too.
The idea is also not to manipulate Rob, right? Because if I try to manipulate, it's game over. Like, you will, on some level, you will sense that. And if you won't sense that during the conversation, then you will sense that afterward. But at some point, like I learned that time and again, you cannot change people. They can only change themselves. And so the only thing that I can do is just engage in that exploration together. And what I need to do all the time is notice where I'm at, right? So going back to the beginning of our conversation, if I'm not centered, I cannot show up as a partner to a conversation. If I want to create a certain effect in Rob, it's game over. So I need to show up where I'm centered and unattached and engage in that dance with the other side.
I'm going to make this a little bit more concrete because this is very interesting. So let's say you had a little skin in the game. Like, let's say you're coaching a manager because you've observed that manager doing something that you feel is potentially offensive to, say, a customer. You have some skin in the game. You don't want the person doing that in front of the customer. Are you still able to get to that centered place of like sort of non-judgment or non-attachment about it?
Sometimes at the beginning, no. And then I will actually not show up to that conversation. I will wait. I will take a deep breath, and I will make sure that if I'm noticing a lot of fear, anger, and so on, that I can like flush that out before I show up to talk to someone else. And when I don't do that, by the way, it's like I mentioned at the beginning, I cause harm.
Okay. So what's your process to sort of flesh that out or show up in a more centered way?
I think I lead mostly from my belly versus from my head. So I constantly just kind of like notice where's my belly at, right? Like even now, like in this conversation, I notice my belly like a few times kind of like tightening. And so I noticed that, and then I let that loosen up. And that's why I have a big belly, by the way. So I can that's those kind of things.
And when you tune into your belly, you're tuning into your body, you're tuning into sensations, into emotions.
Yeah, and to me, where some people feel fear mostly here, some people feel here. I feel most of the time where I feel stress is in my belly. That's where it goes. And so the way for me to, first of all, in order to solve a problem, first of all, you need to acknowledge it exists, right? So in order to actually be centered, first of all, I need to notice that I'm out of center. And I usually notice that in my belly. But that's kind of like my step number one.
All right. I want to recap a couple of things you said. That's, because it's amazing. Sometimes these gems just sort of flash by you. You said in order to solve a problem, you have to acknowledge that it exists. And I think that's a really powerful presupposition, to sort of, I'm going to take that and play with that. But the other thing is you're tuning into your body. You're tuning into your system's internal sort of signaling to you. Something's out of kilter. One of my signals is if I'm hesitating sharing something with someone, I know something's off. Like that's one of my signals. You know, it's like, ooh, am I kicking the bull here, right? Mm-hmm. And then I know I need just some more work that I have to do. So in answer to your question, where we were was, I was asking you in an interaction with this hypothetical manager who's potentially offending the customer. I was asking you, how do you get yourself to center so that you can get on that call potentially with that person and talk to them or give them feedback? And you were saying the first thing you do is tune into your belly
and noticing, am I out of center? And if I am, then, you know, by now I've done that enough times that I know how to bring myself to center a lot quicker than, you know, I don't know, a decade ago. And in the rare cases where I cannot, then I know I'll go out for a walk, I'll delay the conversation, whatever I need to do. The way that I would show up to the call, I would say, hey, I observed the client responding in X, Y, Z. I'm curious, what was your experience, right? And 9 out of 10 times, people actually know that they screwed up somewhere or like something didn't go well. The journey of healing like starts already, but I didn't need to come in and say, hey, that didn't go well. Again, it goes back to, I don't know about you, but I always think that my ideas are better than everybody else's, right? And so, like,
I assume your ideas are better than everyone else's too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if the other person actually realizes something about themselves and how they showed up to that conversation with the client, that's 10 times better than Yoav telling them that.
I have so many questions that are coming up.
I'm sorry, one more thing that I realized, and that I learned from teachers and spiritual teachers and, you know, Zen and so on throughout many years, is that you really see mastery when I remember just noticing mastery when you see the other side doing very little, which almost you look at them and say, okay, come on, I can do that. Like, that's easy. But there is something about the way that they set up the environment and, so to speak, the container between two people or a group of people. And sometimes, I mean, often they actually step back and just let things unfold, because they did such a masterful job with just setting up the environment so people feel safe and curious and want to engage in that exploration, versus feel like, oh my God, I arrived and now I'm being judged, I'm being evaluated.
I guess we're in the midst of unpacking how you set that up and create that safety. Usually you're giving feedback to somebody who in some way, shape, or form is reporting up to you.
Right.
I'm wondering how this pans out when somebody is at the same level or a senior in an organization, or just, you know, perhaps a friend that you're not working with. Like, if you were just giving me feedback, we weren't working together, like, do people say, like, you know, why are you giving me feedback? Like, who are you to give me feedback?
Yeah, I wouldn't actually give you feedback again. I would just share with you my experience. You know, I recently actually had a conversation with an executive in the company, and I shared with them that I noticed that I lost trust in them. And I didn't show up and I said that they did anything wrong, because I don't know that, right? All I know is that I noticed in my own experience is that I lost trust in them. And that's the beginning of the conversation. And then I literally say, and I wanted to talk about that because I care too much about our relationship and I care about you. And I don't want to continue carrying that, because again, my experience in the past is that I was very good at kind of like just accumulating more and more of these layers of just resentment. And life becomes like very heavy. Like a lot of the interactions that I had with different people were just littered in with, or like there was so much gunk in the channels between us. It did not feel enjoyable. And so going back to that conversation that I just mentioned, I mean, that's how I started it. And then we had a great conversation, and the other person also showed up very authentically, and we just explored it together. And by the end of that conversation, I felt like whatever resentment and lack of trust that I had almost completely evaporated.
That's amazing. You know, there are a couple of things that I'd like to double click on there. One is, it doesn't sound to me like you went into that conversation and said, I've lost trust and you're a bad person.
Oh, not at all. No.
You know, it's like, oh, I've lost trust, which, you know, if I read that in a title of a book, I would immediately put it to, and the person's a bad person. But it's like, for you, it's more like talking about the weather. Like, oh, I noticed the weather's like overcast today. So that's interesting. The other thing is, I'm really curious, and this is something I do know about you. Like, if you sense something strange in a relationship, you'll bring it up.
Absolutely.
Like, you know, that's, if you hang around with Yoav, you can count on that. I think sometimes if I'm like, let's say I have something with a friend and I think, oh, this is something I'd better bring up, I think I have a lot of fear that the person will react to that and get angry or get offended. And so a lot of times I'll think, well, it will iron out over time. And sometimes it does, but sometimes, like you said, it accumulates gunk.
Right.
So I guess, are you never concerned about the person's reaction, or?
Quite the contrary. I'm just afraid as the other guy. Yeah. I'm afraid, and I don't want to hurt people. I'm afraid of their reaction. Like, I don't know what I'm getting into, but at the same time, I don't have any other choice, because the experience of continuing to carry that, the cost of that is to me is prohibitive. So I'd rather actually deal with the discomfort in the short term versus deal with the consequences in the long term
of not bringing something up and it growing. Okay. Do you ever start small and build up?
Say more.
I'm trying to think of a good example, but I guess, like, you know, when we first met, if I thought there was something like, wow, I was really full of it, you know, and I'm the one who's going to tell him this, right? But if I suspected, like, if I bring this up now, not only is he not going to hear it, but I'm probably going to lose the friendship. I might seek to build trust with smaller examples first. You know, it's like, I'm not going to talk about the shirt, but I might talk about the sleeves of the shirt or something like that. I guess I'm wondering, is there a way of that you baby step or build your comfort in bringing up an issue of a particular magnitude with somebody?
Yes, I do. But it's not actually delaying talking about certain things that are look, like if you and I are in some kind of a relationship, professional relationship, right? And you did something that is on a scale of 1 to 10, 9, right? Severity, I mean. And it has a severity of 9. I don't care if I know you for a day or for a decade. I have to bring that up because clearly you had enough power in this relationship to do something of that severity, right? And so we need to talk about that. The way that I will probably bring that up, obviously, Rob, I know for many years, and so I will kind of like ramp up to a place where we can have that kind of conversation faster. But I will do that regardless, and I will probably just kind of like heat up the conversation slower with someone that I have, for lack of a better word, less rapport with. But I will not avoid it.
What advice would you give someone that perhaps is working on a team and they see their senior leader doing something that is questionable? I'm trying to think of an example. We recently, to give a little context, we recently had sort of a group session in the company talking about kind of the dynamics of different levels of position and how that impacts people's willingness to speak up. If I'm working on a team and I saw the leader being kind of like overly macho or something and creating some intimidation inadvertently, I think I would be nervous to bring it up because I might lose my job, for example, or I might lose favor. So is there anything any recommendation you would have in that situation? Or would you also just kind of like, okay, that's the way that person is, and let it go?
I mean, first of all, specifically
sometimes we don't have the luxury, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, if you're the busboy at Starbucks, you can't tell the CEO that that he's being offensive or something like that.
Well, specifically about our company formula, I hope that we're different. That's kind of like my first response. But when I was hearing the question, I thought that I've rarely in my life came across people that did not essentially, for lack of a better word, succumb to vulnerability, right? Vulnerability is such a powerful tool that if you show up vulnerably and authentically to someone, again, without judging them, just sharing your experience, I think most people care about the impact they have on others, right? Now, all of us have our demons, obviously. And so the person that you're describing, the manager that is macho or whatever behavior that inhibits others from speaking up and so on, I am sure that they don't want to do that either, right? They want to get free of that. There is something very powerful, I can tell you from experience, of people that report to you, coming to you and just sharing their experience. And like going back again to the beginning, that person sharing like how I heard them with my words, with my poor choice of words, that had a really profound impact on me.
You felt impact that had hurt them.
Absolutely, yeah.
I have to imagine that if you're a leader and you're giving a lot of feedback, you're simultaneously opening the door for feedback for yourself.
Yeah, and that happens often as well.
Got it.
But again, it doesn't feel like feedback.
I think feedback might be the wrong word.
Yeah, it's like someone asked me like a while back, what is my philosophy for leading? And my response was, I don't have a philosophy. I just have relationships with people, right? I have a relationship with Rob, and I have a relationship with Katie, and I have a relationship with George, and I have with Amanda, and I just have relationships, and I try to show up as authentically as I can in each of these relationships. And yes, in most of these, if not in all of these relationships, I show up as a leader, but it's just one facet of who I am as a person. I hope that I have other dimensions and other facets that I have to offer.
The other thing that occurs to me, and I'll bring it back to the beginning, why we're talking about this. Like I said in the beginning, Yoav has a certain gift for, I would say, if we won't call it feedback, for certainly for talking about things that other people might find a little bit uncomfortable, or bringing up the elephant in the room, and doing it really without judgment, or at least it doesn't feel judgmental to me. I think another thing that impacts that or makes that possible is definitely in this company. We talk about this idea of radical candor, but I would say even more impactful than that is these conversations aren't like devastating in nature. Like I think there's sort of a tip around feedback, which is like little and often, like as an operating principle. So it's not like, Rob, we need to talk, and I'm like, oh no, Yoav put time on my schedule, I'm in trouble. Like,
You're right.
It's more like all of us are doing this all the time in a certain respect. It's like, hey, I noticed on that call today, it really seemed like you pissed off the customer. Let's talk about that. So I think it's much lighter, perhaps, and I think that maybe that's part of creating that environment of safety.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot in that. If you go to the gym once half a year and you lift like 500 pounds,
Yeah.
You're not going to actually get in shape, right? And so it's much more about going 3-4 times a week to the gym and, I don't know, lifting 50 pounds.
Right.
That's how you get in shape.
Right. All right. Well, I think that's a good place for us to tie a bow on this conversation. I want to do a part 2 on that bit we talked about in the middle of you modeling people. Like I would love to double click on that a little bit more, but I think this is a good stopping point. So thank you again for joining me. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.